All right, so moving on to a different part of the series, what I want to kind of talk about is using functions in JavaScript. Now, this is going to be one of the most complex topics, in my opinion, if you're a beginner, is learning how to use functions to make your code more clean and more efficient. So I'm going to walk you through how you can define functions, how you can use functions, and then also show you a couple of useful helper functions that exist on existing JavaScript objects. So for example, the array object has a method on it called map. And we can use that to basically do the exact same thing we did here with rendering over all the previews and concatenating them into this inner HTML. So do note, I did refactor this a little bit. If you notice here, we don't have like an external variable where we keep concatenating strings onto. I figured out after making the video, I could have just done this, like keep on appending some text to the inner HTML like this, and that'll clean up your code a little bit. All right, so let's talk about functions, okay? So functions are a way to basically take some logic and abstract that away into a single statement that you can execute. So that was a really generic definition, but I think it'll make a lot more sense when we start seeing it. So typically, let's say that you wanted to write a function to maybe render out some component, okay? So generate some string. Technically, all of this logic inside of here could be abstracted out into a function, so that we don't have to keep on doing a plus equals. It'll make more sense if we just call a function. All right, so there are two different ways in JavaScript to define functions. I'm going to go ahead and show you them both, but we are going to stick to one approach for most of this series. So the first way, which is the way that we probably aren't going to do that much, is you can put function, the keyword, and then I could put any type of label for my function name, right? So I could call it like create post, and then I'm going to put some parentheses and then some curly braces, right? This is the syntax for creating a new function. And what you can do in that function is put any code that you want, right? So I could put like some console logs here if I wanted to. Let's say hello. And I could print it out 3 times or something. Now notice when I run this, nothing's actually going to print out, right? Because all we're doing is we're declaring something called a function, which gives us the ability to execute it later on if we want to, right? So typically what you do is if you have a button, you can add like an event listener to it. And when you click on the button, you're going to invoke a function. But let's just show you really quick how this works. So I'm going to put a debugger statement, and then I'm going to invoke the function, right? So to call a function, you put the label that you personally defined, and then you just put parentheses to call it, okay? So let's ignore all this right now. Like all this stuff isn't really necessary, but we're going to use this as our little sandbox area. So let's refresh the page, and you'll notice that the code has stopped on a breakpoint somewhere. Let me go to the index.js here. All right, so you see here there's a function declared. All right, let me expand this a little bit. So the debugger has stopped on that debugger statement. And if we step through this, you'll notice that when it gets to the create post function statement, if we step over, it's going to print out hello to our console 3 times, right? So all that did was it basically called that function and then ran whatever is inside of it. So let me refresh again, and I'm going to actually do another thing in the debugger that I haven't shown you yet, which is pretty cool. So often when you're debugging code, it's good to step into the internals of the function, right? So if I click on the step over button here, and then look to the right of it, there is a step into next function call. So F11, if I click this, notice that the debugger goes into my actual function code itself. It goes into the block of code, and I can actually step over every individual command that's written in our function to kind of understand what's going on. All right, so if I step over, notice it prints out hello once, and then I do it again, it's going to print out hello again, and then it's going to print it out a 3rd time, and then we can kind of step out of the function call, and we're done. So that is a really high level example of a function, but a function is going to get more complicated down the road as you need to do different things. Like for example, let's say we, instead of printing out the hard-coded string of hello, we wanted to print out something that someone could pass in, right? So let's say we wanted the programmer to be able to pass in some type of string that they want, right? So I could pass in whatever I want here. I could say like, I love JavaScript. And now what we can do is in our function definition, we can declare a parameter, right? So I could put like any label here that I wanted, which is going to become a variable. I'll just name it like text. And now what we can do is we can actually print out text to have the function do some dynamic behavior based on whatever the programmer wanted to do down here, right? So I can call this multiple times if I wanted to. And let's just do that in the debugger real quick. So if I execute this code, the first time it calls create post, it should print out I love JS 3 times, which you can see here. And then I'm calling it again with a different set of a string or a different argument. So then on the second call, I'm actually passing a different string. And if I run that, it's going to print out this argument 3 times, right? So let me break down those two definitions. A parameter is something that you actually have on the function definition, and that defines like what you can pass into the function. An argument is this value that you're actually passing in, okay? So remember those two definitions, of argument and a parameter. A lot of people mix them up. Okay, so we can actually make this more complicated if we want to. The cool thing about functions is that they have the ability to return something, right? So it's kind of like calling up a friend, like you give them some information and they're going to return some information back to you, right? They're going to say something back to you, and that is similar to what you can do in a function. You basically call the function, and when it's done executing, it's going to return you some value. And that is really useful down the road when you just want to like abstract away some logic, have the function return you back maybe a string or a DOM element or something like that. So to have a function return something, what you can do is just put the keyword return somewhere inside your function, and you could just return whatever you want. This could be a string, a number, a floating point, a boolean. You could return other functions if you want to as well. That can get kind of complicated. Or you can also return like DOM elements. Whatever you want, you can return so that we can use it down here. All right, so let's just kind of refactor this a little bit and have this return like a message, like what is up. And now, actually I'm going to put like this in a div. I'm going to wrap this in a div. So I'll say like, what is up? And then what we could do is I could actually take the value that's returned here and I can put it inside a variable. So I could say like post is equal to create post. And we are actually going to interpolate some text here. So let me actually make this a little bit more complex. We learned about what string interpolation is on a previous video. Using these backticks, you can use the money sign, curly brace, and kind of inject some text. So before we run this, if you just look at it, we are defining a function that takes in one parameter, and that parameter is going to be used to generate some text, right? And then after the function is done, it's going to return that text back to whatever is calling it. So let's just run this. And if I step through, notice that we are going to call create post. That is going to return us some text. So that has a return value of div I love JS. And then if I were to click step over again, you'll notice that inside of our script, we have the post variable here, which was actually set to that div. So let's just keep building upon this and take this a step further so that we really understand what's going on with functions, because this is super important to understand. So let's pretend that we had all this logic back here again, and we are going to basically do a for loop like we did before, but instead of having this hard-coded inside this for loop, let's abstract this out into a function that we can just basically return, right? So I'm going to have a create post function like we have here, and that is going to return that string. All right, so now notice that this string requires posts, right? So what I need to do is change this to post. And then what we could do is call that function in our for loop here, and I could pass that post object. So let me do that. And I'll put a break statement here, or I'll put a debugger statement here so we can actually follow along. I'll say debugger. All right, so let's again step through this with the debugger and try to understand what's going on. So you remember here we have a for loop that's just looping through every post in the array. And as we get each post one by one, we are going to call the create post function, and we are going to pass it that object that has a description, an image, and some title. So if I were to click the step into function call, you'll notice that we get here, and that is going to just basically return a string that was interpolated with all the post values here, okay? So if I click step out, that should go back to the for loop, and you'll notice that on the DOM element itself, our post showed up. I can keep stepping through, and we'll see more posts show up. Finally, if I click play, everything just shows up for us, okay? All right, so that is super, super useful and super powerful. And again, this is like a really simple example, but as your application gets larger and larger, there's gonna be times where you need to take logic wrap it in a function and move it somewhere else to keep your code more manageable. And then you can call that function and pass it dynamic values to get back a dynamically generated return value. So let me take a step back. Remember how we kept using console logs, right? We did console.log and I said hello, right? This is actually a function that we're calling. So the log function is a function that's attached to the console global object. You remember console is just a global variable that happens to have a property called log, and that property happens to be pointing to a function that you can pass an argument. All right, so whenever you call this, that's how you print stuff out to the console log down here, right? So this might not have been explained before in the series, but this is basically what's going on. In the JavaScript language, they defined a log function that you can pass a string and have it print something out to a console. So that's pretty cool. We've been using functions this whole time. We didn't really know about it. So it turns out there's other functions that are kind of attached to generic JavaScript objects, right? So if you go back to the array, let me just go ahead and print out an array here. Remember we have this array called posts. If I print this out, in fact, I don't need to print it out. Let's just put a debugger here and we can inspect that. So let me expand this up a little bit and we're going to hover over posts. Notice that if you hover over it, there's something called a __ proto. And if you expand this, you'll notice that it has a bunch of different properties on it, right? It has like concat, it has every, it has for each, it has something called map. Those happen to be a set of properties that are attached to every array that you define in JavaScript, and you can actually invoke those properties to do different things. So for an example, if we wanted to, instead of doing this hard-coded for loop, we could do posts.forEach, which happens to be a property that's defaulted on the array's prototype, and then we can pass it whatever function that we want, right? So we could pass it the create post function that we just did, and that could kind of execute some code here. I might have to restructure this a little bit. Let me do this. I have to kind of pull this apart a little bit so it'll work. But yeah, so now we don't actually need to do a for loop here. I think if we actually run this, let me go ahead and save and refresh. We do have an issue. So post string, okay, so I need to do this. All right. So you notice here, it's printing out the exact same things to our JavaScript page or our DOM. But the difference is that now we don't have to do that for let post of posts. We could simply just call post for each and then pass it whatever function that we want, right? So this is doing the exact same logic of the for loop that we had, but it's a little bit cleaner and it makes a little bit more sense. And you just have to kind of memorize these, right? There's like for each, there's map, there's filter. There's a lot of useful array prototype methods where you pass in a function and it's going to basically call that function for every element in the original array. So if you remember when I started this section, I said there's two ways to create functions. There's this way using the function keyword, but you can also declare something called a fat arrow function. Okay, so that's typically the approach I do for all my functions. And the syntax is a little bit different. Instead of saying function create post, you can declare a variable called like const create post. And you need to set that equal to a parentheses, your parameter list, and then this fat arrow here, okay? So unfortunately, you just have to memorize this, right? You're pretty much declaring a variable and you're setting it equal to a fat arrow function. Now, it basically runs the same way as it did before, with some caveats with like this keyword, which we're not going to get into because it's too complex. But this does the same thing. It's a little bit more cleaner to read because you don't have that function keyword kind of pasted all over your code. You just have to kind of remember that this is actually the exact same. This is a function that takes in one parameter and it just runs some code here, okay? So with that being said, we're going to keep on building upon this, so just stick with me. What we see a lot, right? This is what we do a lot in JavaScript, is instead of declaring a create post variable that we only use once, a lot of times we just cut and paste that whole function definition right here into the for each, right? That is the exact same code as it was before, but it's a different way to basically use it. This is called like an anonymous function. You're not actually assigning this function to a variable. And the reason we do this is because we don't ever need to use this function anywhere else, right? So it makes more sense to just define it right here and maybe pass it in. Now you might argue, okay, this is not as easier to understand. You might be right. but unfortunately, this is kind of how we do it with a lot of stuff. And I'm actually going to take this a step further. So let me show you another, let me kind of undo some of this stuff. I'm going to show you another function that's attached to the array prototype, right? This is called the map function. So I'm going to change for each to map and kind of show you what's going on here. So the map function is a little bit more complex. It loops through every element of your array, and it's going to kind of modify the element and return a new form of your element, right? So if you pass in an array of 3 elements, the map function is going to give you back an array of 3 elements, but the actual values that those elements have could have been modified, right? So what I'm going to do, just to kind of show you, is I could have this function return like false for everything if I wanted to. And if I actually run this, I'll just do this, and I'm going to put a debugger here. So let me run this, and you'll see if I hover over test, it happens to be an array of 3 values, okay? So again, what it did is it basically loops through every post. It calls the create post method, and we are going to get the post. We're going to run this code here, but then we're returning false, right? So that's why the value of every entry in this array is set to false. You can set this to whatever you want. Like I could set this to post string if I wanted to. And now test is going to be an array of 3 different preview components, okay? This is actually what we do a ton when you're dealing with React. We're using the map function all the time. So this is really important to understand. So again, I don't know if I should use the debugger and kind of step through what's going on, but basically whatever your function returns, it's going to put into the same index of your original function that was passed in, or your original array that was passed in. So what we do a lot in React is we are going to, instead of setting inner HTML here, we are actually going to set this, and we are just going to return that post string here. And what I'm going to do is show you another function that we need to use. All right, so let me just refresh this real quick. I'll do a debugger here and run it. So if I step over this, you'll notice that inner HTML is actually set to an array of posts. All right, so I'm actually gonna, so I can actually show you this, I'm gonna say const the posts is equal to this, and then I'm just gonna change the inner HTML to the posts. So let's step through this. If we step through twice, you'll notice that the post again is an array of 3 elements, and those elements happen to be that preview post that we just returned dynamically from this function. But notice that when we actually set the inner HTML, I'll just go ahead and step over that, click play, those posts are showing up in our DOM, right? The only issue is that there's like a weird comma that is put in between them. So this is a little issue with trying to set inner HTML to an array of strings. Basically, it's going to put commas in your DOM, which is not something that you want. So there's another function that is attached to the array prototype called join. And what that does is it basically takes all of the elements in your array and does some string concatenation on them, okay? So very similar to what we're doing in the old for loop where we declared a variable and just did like a plus equals. You can actually do the same thing with a join. So I'll say join, and I believe you might need to pass it an empty string. So what this is doing is basically taking all 3 elements of that array, which happen to be strings, and concatenating them together into a larger string. All right, so if we actually do a debugger and print this out, we will see that the posts is a huge string and all the commas have been removed. So now that the commas don't show up anymore in the DOM. All right, so we're almost there. This whole video is leading up to showing you how we typically do stuff in React, but you can do the same approach in vanilla.js. Granted, you have to use this join thing, okay? So at this point, the code looks great. Like this is, you can keep the code looking like this if you want to, and there's no issue with this. I could argue that this code is actually pretty clean. It's easy to understand, it's easy to read, but sometimes in React, what we do is we just put the full definition of the component, assuming it's small. If it's really large, then yeah, you probably want to pull it out into a function. But what we do is we'll take that whole anonymous function and we'll paste it right into the map function here, okay? So this happens to be the exact same logic. So you'll see here we get the same outcome. We get 3 elements displayed on the page. But the benefit to this is that you can start nesting HTML inside of other HTML here, right? So if I wanted to, I could do some more string interpolation here, and I could wrap all of this in a div, like so. And notice that if I wanted to add a class of like hello world or something, that should show up somewhere on the page now. Right? So we have a div that's wrapping all this. Honestly, if you've looked into React at all, this is almost what is going on behind the scenes. Other than the JSX is a nicer way to kind of do this because you get the syntax highlighting and it's a little bit cleaner. But you can achieve almost the same results using this approach that I'm showing you here, right? You have to kind of format it to look a little nicer. But this is how you could potentially create your own components using, string interpolation and templates. And that is what we're going to be continuously doing in this video. So just keep that in mind. And in fact, now that I look at this, this actually doesn't look that clean. So I'm actually going to pull this out and say like const create post, make that equal to a function, and I'm going to pass that into that function here, right? So this looks a little bit cleaner. You can tell right off the bat that this is a function that is going to call, make some components, join them together, and print it out in the DOM. All right, so that was quite a lot of information. I hope you all didn't get too lost with that. Again, use your discretion of when you want to actually nest some of the stuff inside of your component here. If you want to make this a little bit more React-like with like web components or something, you could just, instead of create post, you could just do a map of posts or something. And that makes it a little bit more understandable that we're basically rendering out a post multiple times based on how many elements are in this array. And you can kind of play with this and kind of restructure it the way you want, but I think this is a good starting point to build more complex applications where dynamic data has to be rendered to the page. And again, make sure you understand functions, make sure you understand arrays, because we are going to be using a ton of this stuff when we start building out the backend for where this data should come dynamically, okay? So keep that in mind, and let's just continue forward.